When the Light Fades, by Sasha. Chapter 1. Shadows in the Silence. The town of Alder Creek had always been quiet, its streets bathed in the soft glow of street lamps that flickered with a rhythm as regular as the pulse of its residents. Nestled in the heart of the valley, it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, or so it seemed. But beneath the calm, beneath the mundane routines of daily life, something had started to stir. Something dark. Detective Elias Mercer stood in the middle of the empty town square, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn leather coat. The chill of the evening air bit at his skin, but he didn't feel it. His eyes were focused on the building in front of him. The Alder Creek Police Station, a small, aging structure that had seen its share of cases over the years. Yet none like this. The disappearances had started a month ago. First, it was easy to brush them off. People came and went in small towns like this. Maybe someone had gone off on a whim, left without telling anyone. But soon the pattern became undeniable. One by one, people were vanishing without a trace. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just empty homes and unanswered questions. Elias had been called in to investigate after the fourth disappearance. It was his reputation that had preceded him, his sharp instincts, his relentless pursuit of truth, his ability to read a room like an open book. But in Alder Creek, the truth was buried under layers of lies, and the people here had grown accustomed to ignoring the things they didn't want to see. He stepped inside the station, the creak of the door sounding louder than it should in the quiet of the night. Officer Emily Richards, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes, sat hunched over a desk. She barely looked up as he entered. "Detective Mercer," she said, her voice strained. "We've got another one." Elias didn't need to ask for the details. He already knew the pattern. The name would be unfamiliar, another face lost to the shadows. And yet, somehow, the case felt different this time. There was something in the air, something thick, like the town itself was holding its breath. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "Sarah Collins," Emily replied, her eyes flicking to the file in front of her. "Her family's devastated. She was just a kid, 19, fresh out of high school. Everyone loved her." Elias nodded, his jaw tightening. Another young life swallowed whole by the silence of Alder Creek. He took the file from Emily's hands and flipped it open, skimming the details. Sarah had gone missing 2 nights ago. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. Just gone. "Do you have any leads?" Elias asked, his eyes scanning the file. Emily shook her head. "Nothing solid. We've talked to the family, the friends, even the neighbors. They're all worried, but no one saw anything unusual. It's like she just vanished into thin air." Elias felt a flicker of unease in his gut. The pattern was becoming clearer now. The victims weren't strangers, weren't outsiders. They were part of the fabric of this town, deeply woven into the lives of the people here. Their disappearances were a stain on the very soul of Alder Creek, a wound that wouldn't heal. "This doesn't feel like a random thing," Elias muttered more to himself than to Emily. "No," Emily agreed, her voice small. "It's like someone's picking them off, one by one. Elias didn't respond immediately. His mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle that had been scattered across the town. He could feel the weight of it settling on him, pressing down harder with each new case, each missing person. It was as if the town itself was holding a secret, one that it was determined to keep buried. "I'll head over to the Collins house," Elias said finally, slipping the file into his coat pocket. "I need to speak with the family." Emily nodded, a look of relief crossing her face. She had been running on fumes for days, and Elias knew she wasn't the only one. The town had begun to fray at the edges, the fear creeping into every conversation, every glance. Something was coming, and no one knew what it was. The Collins house sat on the outskirts of Alder Creek, its front porch dimly lit by a single porch light. The windows were dark, save for a faint glow from inside, the shadows of the family still moving behind drawn curtains. Elias walked up the cracked path to the front door, his boots crunching the dry leaves that had piled up in the corners. As he reached for the doorbell, he hesitated for a moment. This wasn't just another case. The look on Emily's face had told him that. It wasn't just the missing girl. It was something more, something he couldn't yet put into words. The door opened, and Sarah's mother, a woman whose face had already been ravaged by grief, stood in the doorway. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression blank. She didn't seem surprised to see him, just weary, like she had been waiting for this moment. "Detective Mercer," she said, her voice hoarse. "Please come in." Elias followed her inside, the warmth of the house offering little comfort against the chill in his bones. The living room was small, cluttered with old furniture and family photos that seemed to be frozen in time. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and something else, something sour that he couldn't quite place. "Can you tell me what happened?" Elias asked gently, his voice quiet. Mrs. Collins sat down on the couch, her hands trembling in her lap. "Sarah, she was just like any other girl. She had her whole life ahead of her. She wasn't like the others. She didn't run away. She couldn't have." Elias noticed the flicker of doubt in her eyes. A small part of her wasn't convinced, but it was the same thing he had heard from every other family: denial, fear, and an unwillingness to accept the reality that their loved ones were gone forever. Was she involved in anything strange? Anyone who might want to hurt her? Elias asked, trying to probe for any lead, any hint of something out of the ordinary. Mrs. Collins shook her head slowly. "No, nothing like that. She was just a kid. She was seeing someone, but it wasn't serious. Just a friend, really." Elias felt a flicker of suspicion rise in his chest. A friend. It was a vague answer, too vague. But he had learned long ago that people rarely volunteered the truth without being asked the right questions. He needed more than just this. "Do you mind if I take a look at her room?" Elias asked, his voice careful. Mrs. Collins hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Of course. It's upstairs." Elias followed her upstairs, his eyes scanning the house as he moved. The walls were lined with family pictures, each one capturing moments of happiness that now seemed distant and foreign. When they reached Sarah's room, Mrs. Collins hesitated at the door. I don't know what you'll find in there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias opened the door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The room was neat, almost too neat, as if the life within had been carefully organized and packed away. There was a bed with a white comforter, a desk piled high with books and papers, and a closet that stood ajar. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning every corner. There was nothing that immediately stood out. No signs of a struggle, no indication that Sarah had been forced to leave. But as his gaze lingered on the desk, something caught his attention. A small silver pendant lay on top of a pile of books. Elias reached for it, turning it over in his hand. It was a delicate piece of jewelry, nothing extraordinary, but it felt heavy in his palm, as if it held a secret of its own. He slipped it into his pocket, a gnawing sense of unease spreading through him. Something about this case felt different. There was a thread here, something that tied these disappearances together, and he was starting to unravel it. But the truth, he knew, would be far darker than anything he could have imagined. Chapter 2. The Darkness Beneath. The following morning, the town of Alder Creek seemed to hold its breath, as if the very ground beneath its feet knew something the people didn't. The sun, weak and distant, barely pushed through the gray clouds that had settled in the sky, casting long, somber shadows over the streets. Elias stood by his car, staring at the small silver pendant that he had taken from Sarah Collins' room. It was delicate, an old-fashioned piece of jewelry that seemed out of place in the life of a young woman. But there was something about it that made his instincts twitch. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was a clue, a thread that might lead him deeper into the mystery. The necklace had been placed on Sarah's desk, seemingly with no regard for its significance, like it was an afterthought. It was strange, too deliberate in its placement to be forgotten, too ordinary to stand out. Elias examined it closer, the small engraving on the back catching his eye. The letters were faint but legible, LC. His brow furrowed. It was a simple combination of initials, but it felt like a puzzle piece just waiting to be connected. Who was LC? And what did they have to do with Sarah's disappearance? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Emily Richards approaching. Her expression as tired as ever, her uniform slightly askew as though she had been running on nothing but coffee and adrenaline for days. "Detective," she said, her voice tight. "We've got another problem." Elias nodded, slipping the pendant back into his coat pocket. "What now?" Emily's eyes flickered with unease. "There's been another disappearance. This time, it's the town's librarian, Helen Parker. She's been missing since last night. Her husband's been frantic, searching the house, but there's no sign of her." Elias' stomach tightened. It was no longer a case of random disappearances. There was a pattern forming, one that was becoming more disturbing by the day. Alder Creek was a small town, too small for this kind of thing to be happening without someone noticing. But whoever was behind these vanishings was careful, calculated. And worse, this time the victim wasn't some young girl. Helen Parker was a staple of the community, someone everyone knew. Her absence would send shockwaves through the town. "Let's go," Elias said, his tone sharper now. His mind was already working, piecing together the growing web of mystery. He couldn't afford to waste time. If they were going to stop whoever was doing this, they needed answers, and fast. Helen Parker's house was tucked away on the outskirts of town, a quaint cottage surrounded by overgrown hedges and an old stone fence. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, charming and quiet, but today it felt more like a mausoleum. As Elias stepped onto the front porch, the air felt heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. He rang the doorbell, the sound echoing in the silence that stretched around them. A few moments passed before the door opened, revealing a man whose face had been worn down by worry and sleepless nights. His clothes were disheveled, his hair unkempt. "Detective Mercer?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "You're here about Helen?" Elias nodded, his gaze scanning the man. There was no hiding the pain in his eyes. He was living a nightmare, and every minute spent searching for his wife only seemed to deepen the hole of helplessness within him. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Parker," Elias said, his voice low. "We're doing everything we can to find your wife." Mr. Parker shook his head, the desperation in his eyes evident. "She's not dead. She's gone, but she's not dead. She can't be." Elias stepped into the house, the faint smell of coffee and old books lingering in the air. It felt like stepping into a world that no longer existed. The living room was warm, cluttered with bookshelves and knickknacks, but there was a certain emptiness to the space now, a feeling that something important had been erased. "We've searched everywhere," Mr. Parker continued, his voice shaking. "Helen would never just leave. She loved this house. She loved her job. She'd never abandon me. I don't understand. I don't understand what's happening to our town." Elias studied the man's face, his instincts screaming that there was more to this story than what was being told. There was something in Mr. Parker's eyes, a flicker of something that didn't sit right. Fear? Guilt? Or was it something else entirely? "Can I take a look around?" Elias asked. Mr. Parker nodded, stepping aside to let him pass. As Elias moved through the house, his mind raced. He was no longer just investigating a series of disappearances. He was chasing something much darker, something that had roots deep within the town itself. Every house he visited, every family he spoke to, felt like a dead end, a loop of unanswered questions and shifting shadows. But there was a thread, a connection, waiting to be uncovered. Helen's office, at the back of the house, was the first place Elias headed. It was a small room, filled with the scent of old paper and dust. A single desk sat against the far wall, its surface cluttered with stacks of books and papers. Elias began rifling through the papers, his eyes skimming over letters, notes, and lists. A small notebook caught his attention. The cover was worn, its edges frayed from years of use. He opened it slowly, flipping through the pages. It was filled with notes about the town, names, addresses, and in some places, strange symbols that Elias didn't recognize. It seemed harmless at first, a librarian's record of her interactions with the community. But as Elias turned the pages, a chill ran through him. One of the names on the list was familiar. Elsie, the initials again. This time they were written with an almost obsessive precision. Elias' pulse quickened. The connection was there, clearer than before. But it was still just a thread that, if pulled, could unravel everything. He closed the notebook and stood up, his mind racing with the implications. There was something deeply wrong with this town, something buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to surface. And now, with two disappearances in quick succession, it was as if the town itself was being drawn into the darkness. He turned back to Mr. Parker, who was sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, his face pale. "Mr. Parker," Elias said, his voice colder now, "did your wife ever mention anyone named Elsie?" The man froze, his eyes widening. I don't know," he stammered, standing up. "Why are you asking about that name?" Elias didn't answer. He only stepped toward the door, his mind already making connections, piecing together the fragments of the mystery. Something was coming to light now, something sinister. And if Elias wasn't careful, it might just swallow the entire town whole. As he left the Parker house, Elias could feel the weight of the investigation pressing down on him like a vice. Every piece of the puzzle was leading him further into darkness. And the more he uncovered, the more he realized that this wasn't just a string of disappearances. It was something much worse, something that would change Alder Creek forever. Chapter 3: Whispers in the Dark. The streets of Alder Creek felt different now, unervingly quiet, as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Elias drove through the winding roads, his mind still racing with the discoveries from Helen Parker's house. The name Elsie echoed in his thoughts, a recurring puzzle piece he couldn't place. It had to mean something. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was all connected, that the town's peaceful facade was just a thin veil over something far darker. He hadn't told Emily about the notebook. There was no need to, not yet. But as his car rumbled down the narrow road, a deep unease settled over him. This case was starting to feel too personal, too entangled with his own life. Something about it seemed inevitable, as if fate had drawn him into a web he couldn't escape. He pulled up to the local diner, a weathered building with cracked windows and a faded sign that flickered in the wind. The place had been a fixture in the town for decades, and it was where most of Alder Creek's residents came to gather, to talk, to gossip. Elias stepped out of the car, his coat pulled tightly against the cold breeze. Inside, the diner was bustling with activity. The hum of conversation mixed with the clinking of silverware and the sizzle of bacon on the grill. The walls were lined with photographs of the town's history, a testament to the lives lived here, to the quiet rhythms of small-town existence. But beneath the mundane chatter, there was something else, a palpable tension, an undercurrent of fear that Elias could feel in the pit of his stomach. He spotted Emily sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee. She didn't notice him right away, her eyes glued to a folder in front of her. Elias made his way over, pulling out a stool and sitting down beside her. "Any new developments?" he asked, his voice low, almost lost in the noise around them. Emily glanced up, her tired eyes meeting his. "Nothing concrete," she said, shaking her head. "But there's something off about this whole thing. People are talking Elias. They're scared. Scared of what? She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the other patrons in the diner. A woman sat at a table by the window, her hands shaking as she clutched a cup of coffee. Another man sat alone, eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. It wasn't just the disappearances that had people on edge. It was the sense that something was lurking just beyond their understanding, something they couldn't quite name but knew was there. "I don't know," Emily said quietly, "but I think we're dealing with something more than just a few missing people. It's as if something dark has awakened here. People are starting to talk about old stories, things that happened before we were even born." Elias stared at her, his brow furrowing. He'd heard the rumors before, the legends of the town, the whispered stories about things that went bump in the night. But he had always dismissed them as superstition, as small-town folklore. Now, though he wasn't so sure, there was something in the air, a heaviness that couldn't be explained by simple fear. "Like what?" he pressed, leaning in closer. Emily lowered her voice even further. "There's talk of a group, an old club or society or something. People say they were the ones who protected the town from whatever lurked in the dark. But then they disappeared one by one. And now it's like whatever they kept at bay is back." Elias frowned. "What are you saying? You think these disappearances are connected to some old legend?" "I don't know," she replied, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "But the more I dig into this, the more it feels like we're not just chasing shadows. There's a history here, one we don't know, one we're not supposed to know." Her words sent a chill down Elias' spine. He had always trusted facts, always relied on hard evidence to solve cases. But now, as the pieces of this puzzle started to come together, he wasn't sure where the truth lay. Was this just a string of coincidental disappearances? Or was there something deeper at play, something that had been hidden for years, waiting for the right moment to surface? He sat back, staring at the scattered papers in front of Emily. A few names were circled in red ink, others highlighted in yellow. The pattern was becoming clearer, but the more he uncovered, the more he realized just how little he actually knew. Before he could say anything more, the bell above the diner door jingled, and a man walked in. He was tall, his face hidden beneath the brim of a weathered hat. His clothes were nondescript, dark jeans, a leather jacket, and boots that looked worn from years of use. He scanned the room quickly before his gaze settled on Elias and Emily. "Detective Mercer?" The man's voice was low, rough, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time. Elias turned in his seat, studying the man carefully. Something about him felt off. His eyes were hard, unblinking, like he had seen too much to be scared anymore. "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice cautious. The man hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "Name's John. John Carter," he said, his gaze flickering to Emily before returning to Elias. "I've got information on the disappearances. Information you might want to hear." Elias' curiosity piqued. "Go on," he urged. John glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room one more time before he leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just the people who are disappearing. he said. "It's the whole town. Alder Creek is cursed. You're looking in the wrong place, detective. You need to look deeper. Look where no one else dares to. That's where you'll find your answers." The words sent a jolt of cold through Elias' veins. Cursed? The thought seemed impossible. Yet there was something in the man's eyes, something desperate, something unhinged, that made Elias wonder if he was telling the truth. John turned to leave, but before he did, he paused and looked back at Elias, his expression darkening. "Be careful, detective," he warned. "They're watching you now, and you're not the only one looking for answers." As the man disappeared into the night, Elias sat still, his thoughts racing. Who was John Carter? What did he know? And more importantly, who was watching him? He stood up abruptly, the tension in his muscles unmistakable. "We need to find out more about this club Emily mentioned," he said. "It's the only lead we've got." Emily nodded, her face pale. "I'll start digging into the town archives. If there's anything to this, I'll find it." But as they left the diner, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being drawn into something far darker than they could imagine. Something was coming for Alder Creek, and soon the light would fade completely. Chapter 4. Beneath the surface, the night hung heavy over Alder Creek, suffocating the town in its silence. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, stretching long across the streets, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond the reach of the dim streetlights. Elias drove home in a daze, the weight of John Carter's words pressing down on him like a stone lodged deep in his chest. The idea of a curse, a supernatural force behind the disappearances, was absurd. Yet, there was no denying the growing sense that the town was hiding something, something that went beyond the confines of reason and logic. He parked outside his house and sat there for a moment, staring at the dark windows. His home should have felt like a refuge, a place to escape the chaos of the case. But tonight, it felt like a cage, the walls closing in on him, suffocating him. He could already hear the echo of Emily's voice in his mind. "You're looking in the wrong place." Was she right? Were they missing something? He shook the thought away. There was no room for doubt, not when so much was at stake. His family, his wife, Caroline, and their young daughter, Sophie, were still out there, completely unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows. He couldn't afford to get distracted by whispers of curses and legends. His job was to find the truth, to bring the missing people home, to protect his OW. As he entered the house, the scent of Caroline's perfume lingered in the hallway. She had always loved the lavender-scented candles she kept on the mantelpiece. But tonight, even the familiar smells of home felt foreign, unsettling. "Caroline," Elias called, stepping into the living room. There was no answer. His heart quickened, the unease that had followed him all evening surging into something more tangible. He moved quickly, checking the kitchen, the hallway, and finally the bedroom. His gaze flickered to Sophie's room, but the door was ajar. He stepped inside, half expecting to find his wife in there, sitting on the bed, reading a book to their daughter. But the room was empty, the bed neatly made, the only sound the soft creak of the old floorboards beneath his feet. The sense of dread settled over him, thick and heavy. Where were they? A sharp pain lanced through his chest as his phone buzzed in his pocket. He yanked it out, relief flooding him as he saw the name on the screen. Caroline. Where are you? Elias asked, his voice tight with barely contained panic. Why weren't you home? Sorry, Elias. Caroline's voice came through, calm and steady. I'm just down the street at the park with Sophie. We're watching the stars. Elias let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The park? It's almost midnight. Caroline chuckled softly on the other end. I know. I didn't want to wake you, but Sophie was insistent. You know how she gets when she gets an idea in her head. We're fine, Elias. Don't worry. Elias paused for a moment, the tension in his shoulders not easing. I just had a bad feeling. I'll be home soon, Caroline promised. Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning. Elias hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, his gaze fixed on the empty room. He had been on edge all day, and now the nagging voice in the back of his mind wouldn't go away. He knew he should feel relieved, but he didn't. Instead, he grabbed his coat, pulling it on quickly. He had to know. He had to see for himself. The park was a quiet place this time of night, the kind of place that felt like a world apart from the rest of the town. The swing set creaked gently in the breeze, its chains rattling in the darkness. A solitary lamppost cast a weak, flickering light over the empty space, its glow fighting against the ever-encroaching darkness. Elias could see Caroline and Sophie in the distance, sitting on the grass, their faces tilted upward as they stared at the stars. Caroline had always had a fascination with the night sky, her mind forever wondering about what lay beyond. Sophie, on the other hand, had inherited her father's skepticism about the supernatural. She was the kind of child who believed in facts, not fairy tales. As Elias walked closer, a strange sense of discomfort washed over him. The air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something that didn't belong. It was the kind of feeling he'd get when walking through a crime scene, when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up and the world seemed to pause, holding its breath. Caroline? Elias called softly, stepping into the dim light. His wife turned, her face softening when she saw him. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone warm but with an underlying edge of concern. I thought you were working. I couldn't sleep, Elias said, his gaze flickering to Sophie, who had stood up now, her eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at something just beyond the tree line. Everything okay? Caroline followed his gaze, then quickly turned back to him, her expression tight. Yeah, everything's fine. But there was something in her voice, something that didn't sit right with Elias. He could feel the unease creeping in, slowly creeping up his spine. Sophie's eyes didn't leave the trees, her gaze fixed on something Elias couldn't see. Sophie? He asked, kneeling down in front of her. She didn't answer. Sophie, hey, Elias said, his voice firm now, trying to get her attention. Slowly, she turned to him, her eyes wide and distant, as though she hadn't heard him. It's them, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The people in the trees. Elias' blood ran cold. His mind raced as he glanced nervously toward the dark silhouette of the trees on the edge of the park. The shadows seemed deeper there, darker. For a moment, it felt as though they were watching, waiting. "What do you mean, Sophie?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice calm. But Sophie didn't answer. She only pointed, her small finger trembling as she pointed toward the line of trees, her eyes fixed on something that wasn't there. At least, not in the way Elias could see. He followed her gaze, but the trees were empty. The night was still. Caroline reached for Sophie's hand, pulling her closer. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice soothing. "There's nothing out there. You're just tired, sweetheart. Come on, let's go home." But Sophie shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "They're coming," she whispered. "They're coming for us." Elias felt a shiver crawl up his spine. Something wasn't right, and every instinct he had screamed at him that they weren't alone. "Let's go," he said quickly, his hand grabbing Caroline's arm as he pulled her away from the park as they made their way back toward the car. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sense of unease clung to him like a second skin, pressing in from every side. He glanced over his shoulder one last time, but all he saw was the empty darkness of the park, its shadows stretching long and ominous. He couldn't explain it, but something had shifted. The air was different now, heavier, and Elias knew, without a doubt, that the darkness that had begun to creep into Alder Creek was only getting closer. Chapter 5. The Thin Veil. Elias spent the following morning pacing the confines of his home. The shadows of the previous night still clung to him, lingering like the scent of something burnt. Caroline had tried to reassure him, to brush off the unsettling events at the park as a figment of Sophie's imagination. But Elias knew better than to ignore such things. Sophie wasn't the kind of child who made up stories, especially not ones like that. "They're coming for us." The words echoed in his mind, more chilling now than they had been the night before as the hours stretched on. He found little comfort in the usual distractions. He tried to focus on the case, reviewing the details of the missing persons reports, but the nagging feeling of impending danger refused to let him be. The disappearances were starting to feel like part of something bigger, something darker, and the town of Alder Creek, with its quiet streets and friendly faces, seemed to be hiding a secret beneath the surface. A secret that Elias was beginning to fear might cost him everything. He stood in front of the mirror, running his fingers through his hair as he examined the hollow look in his eyes. The exhaustion was starting to show. But it wasn't just fatigue. It was a sense of creeping dread that made it hard to breathe, hard to focus. It was as if the very air had changed, as if the walls were closing in on him, suffocating him with a truth he wasn't ready to face. His phone buzzed in his pocket, dragging him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out quickly, relieved to see that it was a message from Detective John Carter. "John Carter, meet me at the old mill. I think I found something." Elias felt a surge of urgency. He grabbed his jacket, not bothering to explain to Caroline where he was going. The old mill was a long-abandoned building on the outskirts of Alder Creek, a place that had once been bustling with industry, but now stood as a rotting reminder of a time gone by. If Carter had found something there, Elias had no doubt it would be important. The drive was quiet, the roads empty, the only sound the hum of the engine beneath him. The mill loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark and imposing against the backdrop of the gray sky. It looked like something out of a nightmare, the kind of place that seemed to belong to another time, another world entirely. When Elias pulled up, he saw Carter's car parked nearby, the detective standing outside, waiting. His usual sharp demeanor was gone, replaced by something more grim, something that made Elias' stomach tighten. "What did you find?" Elias asked, his voice low, cautious. Carter didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured for Elias to follow him, leading him around the back of the mill. The air grew colder as they approached, the wind picking up and howling through the broken windows of the building. The place was a graveyard of rusting machinery and decaying wood, the silence oppressive. "Over here," Carter said, his voice tight with barely restrained tension. They stopped in front of a rusted metal door, one that had clearly been forced open recently. Carter pulled out a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as he led Elias inside. The air inside was thick with dust, and the scent of decay was overwhelming. As they walked deeper into the mill, Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. There was something unnatural about this place, something that didn't belong at the far end of the room. They stopped in front of a pile of discarded debris. Carter knelt down, his flashlight illuminating something half-buried beneath the rubble. Elias crouched beside him, his stomach twisting as he recognized what lay there at a torn, weathered piece of fabric. A jacket familiar in its design, one that looked as if it belonged to someone who had been here recently. But it wasn't just the jacket that made Elias' pulse race. It was the bloodstains, still fresh, staining the fabric in dark, jagged splotches. "This is one of the missing people's jackets," Elias said, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Carter nodded grimly. "I thought the same thing, but there's more." Elias watched as Carter moved the fabric aside, revealing something more disturbing. Beneath the jacket, hidden in the shadows, was a set of keys, familiar keys, ones that Elias recognized from the police station. They belonged to the missing person, a local bartender named Mark Wheeler. "How the hell did these end up here?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Carter said, shaking his head, "but we've been searching the town for weeks, and no one's come this way. This building's been abandoned for years. And then, this." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The deeper they dug, the more unsettling the answers became. This wasn't just a series of random disappearances anymore. It was something orchestrated, something calculated. They moved further into the mill, following the faint glow of Carter's flashlight. The beam flickered as they passed more discarded objects. Old tools, broken crates, and piles of trash, but nothing that could explain the mystery they were chasing. That was until they reached a far corner of the mill, where the shadows were so deep that the light seemed to vanish entirely. Carter paused, the tension in the air palpable. He swept the flashlight across the ground, his beam landing on something unusual. A trail of footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading into the darkness. "Are we following this?" Elias asked, already knowing the answer. "Don't see why not," Carter replied. "If this leads to more of the missing people, or answers, we have no choice." The trail led deeper into the bowels of the mill, the darkness thickening around them as they moved further into the heart of the building. The sense of dread grew stronger, clawing at Elias' mind. Every step felt like a step closer to something unspeakable. Elias glanced at Carter, but the other man's face was grim, his eyes focused ahead. They had reached the end of the trail, standing at the foot of a crumbling staircase that led down into an even deeper level of the mill. The air here was thick with the scent of mold and rot, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. "This is it," Elias whispered. "This is where the answers lie." Carter didn't answer. He just started down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the silence, each one sending a chill through Elias' spine. Elias hesitated, but only for a moment. He followed Carter down into the darkness, knowing that whatever they were about to find would change everything. And somewhere in the depths of the mill, hidden in the darkness, something waited. Something that had been lurking beneath the surface of Alder Creek for far too long. And it was coming for them. Chapter 6. Into the abyss. The staircase seemed to stretch forever, each step taken in silence, the only sound the muted echo of their boots on the creaking wood. As Elias descended further into the mill's bowels, the air grew thicker, colder, as if the very building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. The walls seemed to close in around him, the dim glow of Carter's flashlight flickering like a dying star in the oppressive darkness. They reached the bottom, and Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering a world separate from the one above. The ground was slick with dampness, the air filled with the faintest scent of decay, mildew, something rotting in the dark. Carter's light swept across the room, illuminating rusted machinery, broken pipes, and piles of abandoned debris, all standing like silent sentinels in the gloom. It wasn't the physical surroundings that made Elias uneasy. No, it was something far more primal. The feeling that they weren't alone, that they hadn't just stumbled upon a hidden layer of the mill, but had entered a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The shadows here were thicker, more alive, as if they clung to the walls with a malevolent purpose. "You sure this is it?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the silence, a touch of uncertainty creeping in. Carter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured with the flashlight, pointing it towards a far corner of the room. Elias followed his gaze, his heart pounding in his chest when he saw what Carter had uncovered at first. Elias thought it was a trick of the light, a heap of scrap metal, perhaps, or a discarded pile of old tools. But as his eyes adjusted, he realized with sickening clarity that it wasn't just debris. It was a man's body. He was slumped against a pillar, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his face frozen in a grimace of pain. Elias swallowed hard, his throat tightening as he stepped closer. The man was familiar Mark Wheeler, the bartender from the missing persons list. But something was wrong, something Elias couldn't put his finger on. He crouched down, examining the body closely. There was no sign of a struggle, no visible wounds, nothing to explain the horror of his twisted posture. But then Elias saw it. The eyes, wide open, staring unblinking, as if the man had died in terror, unable to look away from something that had terrified him beyond reason. "Christ," Carter muttered under his breath, his voice strained. "This isn't how he disappeared. The others, they were gone without a trace." Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the cold skin of Mark Wheeler's wrist. No pulse. The body was still warm, but only just, no more than a few hours since death had claimed him. "We need to get out of here," Carter said, his voice sharp, snapping Elias back to the present. "This place, this whole thing, it's getting worse. We need backup." But Elias didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the body, on the lifeless form of Mark Wheeler. Something wasn't right. The body wasn't just a victim, it was a message. Whoever had left it here wanted them to see it. They wanted Elias to understand something. His gaze drifted to the shadows around them, and for a moment, just a fleeting moment, he thought he saw something move. A figure, just beyond the reach of Carter's flashlight. But when he blinked, it was gone. "Elias!" Carter's voice snapped him out of his reverie. "I saw something," Elias muttered, his voice barely a whisper. He didn't look at Carter, his eyes still searching the darkness. "Someone's here." Carter raised an eyebrow, his flashlight scanning the room more frantically now. "Where? I don't see anything." Elias shook his head. "It's gone now. But I'm telling you, there's something in the shadows." They stood in tense silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the building settling around them. Then, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel echoed from above, followed by a loud, hollow thud that a cold chill raced up Elias's spine. Someone else was in the mill. "Who's up there?" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness that had no answer. Just the sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, moving closer. Elias reached for his gun, his hand trembling slightly, though his grip remained firm. He nodded to Carter, motioning for him to follow. They moved quickly, back towards the staircase, but just as Elias reached the bottom step, the room around them seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer and darker, swallowing up the feeble light from Carter's flashlight. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and Elias felt the oppressive weight of something watching him, something that had been there all along. "Stay close," Carter hissed, but Elias barely heard him over the thundering of his own pulse in his ears. They reached the stairs, but just as Elias stepped onto the first step, the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness. The air turned cold, unnaturally cold, as if something had sucked the warmth from the room, leaving them standing in the dead silence of the mill. At a voice, low, guttural, almost a growl, whispered from the darkness, sending a jolt of terror through Elias's body. "It's too late for you, detective." Elias spun, his heart racing, but he saw nothing in the pitch-black gloom. Just shadows, twisted and crawling along the edges of the room. "Who's there?" Elias demanded, his voice strained, trembling and no answer. Just that voice closer now, so close it felt like it was in his ear. "You've come too far. You've seen too much. There's no going back." Elias's breath hitched, and he felt Carter's hand on his shoulder, pulling him back. "We need to get out of here," Carter muttered, fear in his voice now. "This place, it's not right." But it wasn't just the mill that felt wrong. It was everything: Alder Creek, the disappearances, the bodies that were showing up. It was all connected, and Elias knew it. And as he stared into the pitch-black dark, he understood something he hadn't wanted to admit. The danger wasn't just to the people of Alder Creek anymore. It was personal. It was coming for his family. "We're not alone," Elias said, his voice low, a tightness in his throat. "No, we're not," Carter replied, his voice filled with grim understanding, and as they hurried back up the stairs, the whispering voice followed them, trailing behind like a dark cloud that refused to let them go. "It's too late for you, Detective. Too late for all of you." Elias's heart slammed in his chest as he turned, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadows were closing in, and the truth was beginning to slip away from him. Like sand through his fingers. One thing was certain: the past was never truly gone. And in Alder Creek, the light had already begun to fade. Chapter 7: Fractured Reflections. Elias barely slept that night. The shadows of the mill, that oppressive darkness, clung to him long after he'd left the building, seeping into the corners of his mind, settling beneath his skin. Every creak of the house, every shift in the wind outside, set his nerves on edge. He could still hear the whisper, "It's too late for you." The words had dug themselves into his brain like a splinter, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pull them free. The drive back to the station had been a blur, the world outside the car window a mix of dim streetlights and endless trees. Carter had remained silent, his eyes flicking nervously to the rearview mirror every few minutes. But neither of them said a word about what they'd seen. The weight of the silence between them felt like a ticking clock, each second dragging them closer to something neither of them wanted to face. Elias had only one thought that kept gnawing at him: his family. He couldn't ignore it anymore. What had begun as a case of missing townsfolk had evolved into something much darker. Something that smelled of old secrets and buried sins. Someone had wanted him to find the bodies in the mill. Mark Wheeler's body was just the beginning. But why? And why now? The answer felt just out of reach, like a distant voice calling through foggy dawn. Elias couldn't shake the urge to visit his father's old house. Their old house. It was a place full of memories, good and bad, and more than once Elias had come close to selling it, to leaving behind the last shred of his past. But today it felt like the only place where answers might be waiting. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he drove through the quiet town. Alder Creek looked peaceful in the early morning light, almost serene. The small businesses were just beginning to open, the streets empty save for a few early risers, and the town's old brick buildings stood like silent witnesses to the history they held. Everything looked normal, too normal. But Elias knew better than to be fooled by appearances. The house was on the outskirts of town, near the edge of the woods, far enough away from the main street to feel isolated but close enough to be a part of the town's slow heartbeat. It had been his father's pride and joy, well, that and the bottle. Elias had spent years trying to outrun the ghosts of that house, but something about it still held him in its grip. He parked the car in the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires as he stepped out. The air was thick with the scent of pine trees and damp earth, the morning mist still hanging low in the hollows. The house loomed ahead, its weathered wooden frame still standing strong despite the years. The windows were dark, but he knew the place too well. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards, every patch of peeling paint had its own memory. He walked up the front steps, each one echoing in the stillness, and reached for the door. His hand hesitated just before touching the knob. The feeling of being watched had returned, a cold prickle running up his spine. But when he turned the handle, the door opened without resistance. The house was just as he remembered, dark, quiet, filled with the weight of forgotten days. The air felt stale, like it hadn't been breathed in years, and the silence was almost suffocating. Elias stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. Maybe a clue, maybe a sign that whatever evil had been brewing in Alder Creek had started here. In this very place, he moved through the house, each room more suffocating than the last. The living room was still furnished with his father's old leather chair, worn down by years of use. The kitchen still smelled faintly of the meals his mother used to cook, before she had left, before his father's alcoholism had driven everything into ruin. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, a frozen moment in history that refused to let go. But then, in the hallway, something caught his eye. There, lying on the floor just outside the study, was a book, a thick, leather-bound volume. It wasn't something Elias had ever seen before. He knelt down, reaching for it, and felt a strange jolt of recognition as his fingers brushed against the cover. It was as if the book had been waiting for him. Opening it, he immediately recognized the handwriting, his father's. But it wasn't a journal. It was a list of names. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The names were familiar. Some of them he recognized from the missing persons reports. The rest were a mix of faces he had seen in town over the years. People who had disappeared without a trace. People who had lived in Alder Creek. People whose fates were a mystery. And each name was followed by a single cryptic line. They know. It's too late to stop them. Elias's blood ran cold. The words weren't just a warning. They were a confession. His father had known something. Known about the disappearances, about the darkness that had been festering in Alder Creek for far too long. But he hadn't been able or willing to do anything about it. Elias slammed the book shut, his mind racing. His father had been a drunk, a man who had never fully recovered from the demons of his past. But this wasn't just ramblings of a broken mind. This was something else, something far more sinister. And now, it seemed, it was up to Elias to finish what his father had started. The door creaked open behind him. Elias spun around, his hand reaching for his gun. But it wasn't Carter. It wasn't anyone he knew. The figure that stood in the doorway was a silhouette, its features obscured by the shadows. The only thing Elias could see clearly were the eyes, wide, cold, and unblinking. "You shouldn't have come back," the figure whispered, its voice a hollow echo in the stillness of the room. That Elias's breath caught in his throat. The voice was familiar, too familiar, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. His eyes narrowed as he took a step forward. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, just enough to let the light fall on its face. Elias's blood ran cold as recognition hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Mark Wheeler, the bartender, the man who had disappeared. But Mark Wheeler was dead. Elias had seen his body. "Something is very wrong." The figure smiled, and Elias could feel the weight of the smile. It wasn't a smile of warmth, of familiarity. It was a smile of something far darker. "Too late," the figure whispered. "It's already started." Chapter 8. The quiet before the storm. Elias stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the figure before him. Mark Wheeler, or whatever was standing in his place, grinned, the smile stretched too wide, too knowing. It wasn't the face of a man he had known, but the hollow shell of someone lost. The air in the house turned thick, the oppressive weight of its silence pressing down on him like the darkened corners of the room itself were watching him. "Too late." The words repeated in his mind like a drumbeat, each echo louder than the last. Elias's heart thudded against his chest, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun holstered at his side. But he couldn't take his eyes off the figure standing before him. The eyes, cold, unblinking, were the same, but the man they belonged to was long dead. He had seen Mark's lifeless body just hours ago, had watched the man slip into the oblivion of the morgue. "Mark," Elias said, his voice hoarse, the word more of a question than a statement. The figure cocked its head slightly, its smile never wavering. "Is that what you think?" It whispered, the voice rasping and thin, as if it had forgotten how to sound human. "Mark Wheeler is gone. But he's not the first, and he won't be the last." Elias's grip on his gun tightened, but still he didn't move. His mind was racing, trying to put the pieces together, but the fragments wouldn't fit. Mark Wheeler had disappeared, his body had been found, and yet here he was, standing in front of him, alive, if that was even the right word for it. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer across the floor, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. Elias stepped back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He had always known Alder Creek was hiding something, but this was a nightmare he couldn't have imagined in his worst moments. "Who are you?" Elias finally managed. His voice low, measured, the figure's eyes glittered in the half-light, a cruel glint in them that sent a chill running down Elias's spine. "I told you already," the figure said softly. "I am what's left, what's always been here, and you've just walked into the center of it." Elias's mind spun, trying to grasp at something, anything that would make sense of this. Mark Wheeler, a man he had known for years, was now something else. But what? The figure, Mark's form but not Mark, took a slow step forward, the floor creaking under its weight. Elias instinctively raised his gun, the cold metal a steady anchor in his hand. He felt the pulse of tension in the air, the sense of an approaching storm, a force he couldn't escape. "I'm not going to ask you again," Elias warned, his voice sharp with authority. "Who are you? And what the hell is going on here?" The figure didn't respond right away. It just stood there watching him, the smile still stretching across its face. And then, in a voice that was not Mark's, it spoke again. "You won't be able to stop it. No one can. You think you're the first to question the disappearances? The others didn't have the strength to look deeper. They believed the lies, and now they're gone." The figure's gaze flicked to the book Elias had dropped on the floor earlier, its eyes narrowing. "Your father was no different." Elias's breath hitched. "My father? What do you know about him?" The figure's smile twisted into something darker, something more sinister. He knew Elias. He knew everything. He saw the patterns, the strings that tie this town to something far older than it appears. But like the others, he couldn't handle it. None of them could. The words hit Elias like a punch to the gut. His father had known. Elias had always thought of him as a failure, a man broken by the bottle. But now it seemed there had been more to his father's descent into madness. There had been something else, something far darker that had driven him to the edge. Elias took a slow step back, trying to steady himself. "What are you? What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, almost as if considering the question. "What do we want? We want what's ours, what's been taken from us. You're just another piece of the puzzle, detective. Another name on the list." The air felt thick with an unseen pressure, as if the house itself was drawing closer, its walls closing in on him. Elias's mind raced. A piece of the puzzle. The list. His father's book. The missing people. It was all connected. But how? "You're not making any sense," Elias spat, his pulse quickening. The figure's smile faltered, just for a moment, before it snapped back into place. "You'll understand soon enough. And when you do, it will be too late." The voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible, as the figure stepped back into the shadows. Just like the others. The coldness in the air deepened, a sharp sting in Elias's lungs as he inhaled. He didn't know what this thing that wore Mark Wheeler's face, was, but he knew it wasn't human. And that realization sent a tremor through him that he couldn't shake. Whatever had taken hold of Alder Creek had spread its roots deep into the town's heart, and Elias was now tangled in its web. The figure melted into the darkness, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Elias alone in the hallway. His mind a storm of confusion and fear, he stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. His hand still gripped the gun, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The truth was beginning to dawn on him, as terrifying and grotesque as it was. What had started as a simple investigation into missing people had transformed into a far more insidious nightmare. And the worst part? His own family was now at the center of it. Elias took one last look around the house, the familiar walls now feeling foreign, hostile. His father had known something. He had seen the signs. And now Elias had to follow those signs, even if it meant losing himself in the process. The house, once a place of memories, now felt like a tomb holding secrets that were never meant to be uncovered. But it was too late to turn back now. Chapter 9. Into the depths. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Alder Creek. Elias stood at the edge of the woods, the cold bite of night creeping into his bones. His eyes scanned the dark expanse before him, as if the trees themselves might whisper the secrets they had been hiding for years. The figure he had encountered in his father's house, the thing that had worn Mark Wheeler's face, was still fresh in his mind, and the weight of its words hung over him like a curse you'll understand soon enough. And when you do, it will be too late. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming for him. The town had always felt like a quiet place, a peaceful little on the map, but the darkness he had uncovered was more than he could have ever imagined. And now, with his father's old journal in hand and the unsettling knowledge that his family was involved in something far more sinister than he could have dreamed, Elias knew there was no turning back. His footsteps crunched on the gravel path as he made his way toward the small, overgrown cemetery on the outskirts of town. The place had always been a graveyard for the forgotten, its stones weathered by time and its name lost in the shuffle of years. But tonight it called to him, like an old friend with a warning. He had to find answers, and they were buried here, in the earth. The wind howled through the trees, making the branches sway like skeletal fingers reaching out to him. Elias's breath came in shallow gasps, the cold gnawing at his skin as he approached the first row of tombstones. He ran a hand over the cracked surface of one of the stones, his fingers brushing the faded name etched into the granite. It was a name he recognized, one of the missing. "Sarah Collins," he murmured under his breath. The woman had vanished weeks ago, her disappearance just one of many that had plagued the town over the years. Her family had given up hope of finding her, and yet here, in the graveyard, her name was etched in stone. Unanswered, unresolved. Is this where it all begins? Elias's thoughts raced as he moved deeper into the cemetery, scanning the tombstones for any other familiar names. His father's journal had mentioned the cemetery, cryptic references, pages filled with half-finished thoughts, things Elias didn't yet understand. But as he walked among the graves, he felt a chill that went beyond the cold night air. The hairs on his neck stood on end, the unmistakable sense of being watched creeping over him like a shiver. He stopped in front of another grave, this one older, its stone cracked and weathered with age. The name on it was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made Elias's heart skip a beat. The date of death was recent, but the stone looked centuries old, its inscription worn and barely legible. As he bent down to inspect it more closely, a sound broke through the night, a rustling in the bushes behind him. Elias spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But there was no one there. The wind, perhaps, or something else. He stood still for a moment, listening, but the silence returned, thick and oppressive. Then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the trees, moving with an unnatural grace, as if it were part of the darkness itself. Elias's pulse quickened. He couldn't make out the face, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was the same figure from his father's house. Mark, or whatever it was that had taken his place. Elias took a step back, raising his gun, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it took another slow step forward, its voice rasping in the stillness. "You're digging where you shouldn't," it said, the words barely audible in the night. "The answers you seek are buried deeper than you realize." Elias's mind raced, his grip tightening on the gun. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice low and controlled. The figure cocked its head, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. "What do I want? I want what's been taken, what was stolen from us, from the town, from you." The words sent a shiver through Elias's spine. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tight with frustration. "You're starting to understand," the figure said, its smile widening. "But it's too late now. You can't undo what's been done." The figure stepped closer, its movements eerily fluid, as though it were gliding across the ground. Elias raised his gun, but the figure didn't flinch, didn't make a move to protect itself. "You think you can stop it?" it whispered, its voice chillingly calm. "But the town has already chosen, and soon you'll see. The darkness will claim you, just like it's claimed the others." Elias's mind whirled, panic clawing at him, but he refused to let it control him. He couldn't let this thing, this creature, break him. He had to stay focused. There had to be something, some way to stop this madness before it consumed him and everyone he loved. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the shadows, but the figure was already gone, vanished into the night like smoke. His heart raced, the weight of the situation pressing down on him with every breath. Elias turned back to the gravestone he had been examining. The name was still unfamiliar, but there was a distinct feeling that he had just stumbled upon something far more important than he could have imagined. The town's history was buried here, and the graveyard was the key. He scanned the surrounding graves, feeling the presence of something ancient and deeply rooted, something that had been waiting for him to arrive. He had uncovered the first layer, but the rest was hidden beneath the earth, waiting to be unearthed. The town of Alder Creek had been living in the shadow of something dark for generations, and Elias was now at the heart of it. His family had been part of it, and now there was no turning back. The wind howled once more, the trees whispering as if they too knew what was coming. Elias stood tall, determined. He wasn't leaving this place until he had the answers he needed. He wouldn't let the darkness win. Not without a fight. Chapter 10. The last light. The storm had come without warning, the winds whipping through Alder Creek like the angry breath of something ancient. Elias stood at the edge of the woods, his coat clinging to his body as the rain lashed against his face. The town, once so peaceful, now felt like a ticking time bomb, its very streets steeped in shadows, its people no longer the familiar faces he once knew. The darkness had settled in deep, and Elias was no longer sure where the line between the living and the dead was drawn. He had followed the trail to its bitter end, to this forsaken cemetery, where the answers he had sought were buried beneath layers of forgotten history. His father's journal had led him here, to the cold graves of those who had disappeared. Names once cherished, now just faded whispers in the wind. But the truth was far worse than Elias could have imagined. And it wasn't over. Why did I in the heart of the storm? The last of the town's secrets lay waiting to be uncovered. He had no more time. His family, his own flesh and blood, were in the grip of something far more dangerous than any murderer or criminal mind. The thing that had haunted him since the beginning had taken root in the very fabric of Alder Creek, and Elias knew that the only way to stop it, to stop them, was to confront it head-on. The cemetery loomed before him, its tombstones like silent sentinels guarding the past. His father's grave stood at the far end, an unsettling presence in the storm's fury. Elias's footsteps were muffled by the pounding rain, the rhythm of his heart quickening as he approached. He hadn't been able to piece everything together until now. The disappearing townsfolk, the strange figures lurking in the corners of his investigation, the thing that had replaced Mark Wheeler. It was all part of a much bigger plan. His father's involvement had been deeper than Elias had ever realized. The man who had raised him had been a part of something ancient, something darker than anyone in the town could fathom. As Elias reached the grave, his fingers brushed against the weathered stone of his father's headstone. The name engraved upon it still felt foreign to him. Victor Garvey, a man he had known all his life, a man he had trusted. But that trust had been shattered by the truth. His father had known the darkness was coming, and he had prepared for it. But even Victor Garvey hadn't been ready for the full extent of what had been awakened. Elias's eyes scanned the ground around the grave, his fingers tracing the earth beneath the stone. There, hidden beneath the surface, was the final piece of the puzzle. A loose stone shifted with little effort, revealing a small, rusted box buried just below the surface. Elias's breath caught as he reached down and lifted the box from the earth. It was old, its edges worn, its lock broken as if it had been opened long ago. Inside, there was a collection of papers, yellowed, brittle, but still legible. Elias flipped through them, the words written in his father's hand. Cryptic notes, unfinished thoughts. The last page caught his eye. It was a warning. They will come for you, Elias. The town has already been chosen. You are the last to know the truth. There is no stopping them now. His heart pounded in his chest as he read the final lines. They are already here. A figure stepped from the shadows, its face obscured by the night, but Elias could sense its presence. The same one who had haunted him throughout this twisted journey. The thing that had worn Mark Wheeler's face. The one that had been manipulating everything from the start. Did you really think you could stop it? The figure whispered, its voice like ice. Elias stood tall, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. But there was no need. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of it, not of the darkness. The truth was out, and he was the last line of defense. It's over, Elias said, his voice steady, but his mind racing. This town has already chosen. It's time to end this. The figure smiled, its eyes gleaming with a cruel understanding. You think you have a choice? You think you have control? The darkness never lets go. Elias's grip tightened on the box in his hands, the weight of his father's final words heavy in his chest. He could feel the pull of the abyss, the pressure of it closing in on him, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. He would protect what was left of his family, his town, even if it meant facing the darkness alone. The figure stepped closer, its form flickering in the shadows, like smoke in the wind. Elias raised the box and slammed it against the figure with all the strength he had left. The world seemed to tremble as the figure let out a low growl, the sound almost human, but something twisted beneath it. The ground beneath their feet cracked open, as if the earth itself was rejecting the creature's presence. Elias staggered back, his breath coming in short bursts as the figure faltered. The storm raged louder, the sky crackling with the tension of the battle unfolding. But in that moment Elias knew. The town's curse had been broken. The darkness had been severed at its core, and the thing that had haunted Alder Creek for so long had lost its hold. The figure crumbled into the wind, vanishing like the shadow it had always been. For a moment all was still. The rain continued to pour, but it no longer felt like a harbinger of doom. It was cleansing. The darkness had passed. Elias stood in the storm's aftermath, the weight of everything lifting from his shoulders. He had done it. He had stopped them. The town was free. But there was no joy in his heart, no relief. He knew what it had cost. He could never go back to the life he had once known. Alder Creek was forever changed, and so was he. His family was gone. His town was gone, and as he turned to leave the cemetery, Elias Garvey realized that the last light of hope was now just a distant memory. The darkness had come, but in the end, it was only his to carry. And as long as he lived, he would never forget the price of knowing the truth.